I came home 3 days early from Reno and found my wife on the kitchen floor with her hand wrapped in a dish towel soaked clean through, and 20 feet away, out on the back patio. My daughter was laughing at something her husband said, loud enough that neither of them heard the door. That's the part that stayed with me longer than the blood did. Not the accident, not even the hospital. The laughing. My name's Raymond Tuck. I'm 64. I spent 33 years as a machinist before I retired last spring. And if you'd asked me back in September whether my family would show up for each other when it mattered, I'd have said yes without blinking. I'd have been wrong, and it took a burned hand and 6 stitches to prove it to me. But I want to start further back than that Tuesday, because I think you need to understand who my wife Carol is, before you understand why what happened next mattered so much to me. Carol and I have been married 36 years this coming December. I met her at a company picnic when I was 28, and too shy to talk to her directly, so I asked her sister instead, and Carol's sister just laughed and pointed and said, "She's standing right there." Genius. Carol still tells that story at every family gathering, and she still laughs at the same part every time, like she's hearing it fresh. That's who she is. She finds the good part of a story, and she holds on to it. She taught 2nd grade for 29 years at Lyndale Elementary before her knees gave out on her. And to this day, grown men and women stop her at the grocery store to tell her she's the reason they learned to read, or the reason they didn't drop out, or the reason they believed they could do something with their lives. She keeps every card those kids ever sent her in a cedar box in the hall closet. Hundreds of them. She knows exactly where that box is if the house ever catches fire, because she told me once, half joking, that it's the only thing she'd grab besides me and the dog. She cans her own tomatoes every August. Still, even though it's just the 2 of us most nights, gives half of it away to neighbors. Remembers every grandchild's dance recital and every allergy and every stuffed animal that has to come along on every overnight visit. She's the kind of woman who apologizes to furniture when she bumps into it. I tell you all this because I need you to understand what I walked into that Tuesday wasn't just an accident. It was what happens when the person who does all that gets treated, even for one afternoon, like she's inconvenient. I'd gone out to Reno for a trade show, something I still do a little consulting work for since I retired, mostly because I get restless sitting around the house too long. I wasn't supposed to be back until Friday. But the second day of the show got rained out, half the vendors packed up early, and I called the airline on a whim and got myself onto a flight that landed Tuesday afternoon instead. I didn't call ahead. I've never been the type to call ahead. Carol always says I like walking into my own house like I'm surprising it. I remember the drive home from the airport, thinking about stopping to get her flowers, then deciding against it because Carol always says flowers just die and then you have to feel bad throwing them away. And instead I stopped at the bakery on Willow and got her a lemon tart. The kind she likes, but never buys for herself because she says it's an extravagance. I had that little white box sitting on the passenger seat when I pulled into the driveway on Larkspur Court and saw my daughter Melissa's SUV parked at the curb, next to a truck I recognized as her husband Dale's. The front door was unlocked, which wasn't unusual, but something about the quiet of the house when I stepped inside made the hair go up on my arms before I even knew why. I heard voices out back, through the sliding door, easy and unbothered, Melissa's laugh carrying the way it does, high and quick, the same laugh she's had since she was 6 years old. And under that, quieter, I heard something else, a kind of soft, wet sound. Someone breathing hard through their nose, the way you do when you're trying not to make noise while you cry. I found Carol sitting on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet, her right hand wrapped up in a dish towel that used to be blue and white check and was mostly red now, cradled against her chest like something broken. There was a cast iron skillet on its side by the stove, and the stovetop still had a burner glowing that low, dull orange, and the whole kitchen smelled like scorched oil. Carol. I was down on the floor in front of her before the bakery box even hit the counter. "Carol, look at me. What happened?" "I'm okay," she said, which is the thing she always says first, and the thing that's never once been true when it comes out that fast and that automatic. Her voice was doing that thing where it's trying to sound steady and failing at the edges. She told me the skillet had slipped off the stove handle when she went to move it, and the oil had splashed up across the back of her hand and wrist, and she'd dropped the whole pan trying to get away from it, which was how it had clattered and scared her worse. and how her ankle had turned wrong stepping back from it too. She said it had happened maybe 10 minutes before I walked in, maybe closer to 15. She wasn't sure. Time gets strange, she said, when you're hurting and nobody's coming. I asked her, straight out, if anybody had heard her. She looked toward the sliding door before she answered, and that look told me most of what I needed to know before a single word came out of her mouth. Melissa came in when it happened, she said. She looked at it and said to run it under cold water and that I'd be fine, that I always make things sound worse than they are. Then she went back out to Dale and her dad. Her father, Melissa's father-in-law, a man named Gary who I'd met exactly twice in 4 years, once at the wedding and once at a 4th of July, and hadn't thought about since. I want to tell you I stayed calm because I'm a naturally calm man. That's not really true. I stayed calm because something in me had gone very still and very cold, the kind of stillness where, you know, if you open your mouth right then, nothing good is going to come out of it, so you don't open it at all. I got a clean towel from the drawer. I ran cool water over her hand myself, gently as I could, and I could hear her breath catch every time the water touched the worst of it. I got her shoes on her, the good ones, not the ones that would rub against her turned ankle, and I walked her out through the garage so we wouldn't have to pass the sliding door. The whole time, I could still hear them laughing out back. Easy. Unhurried. Like nothing in that house had gone wrong at all. Straight Agnes Memorial took 6 stitches to close the worst of the burn where the skin had split, and wrapped the rest in gauze from her knuckles to halfway up her forearm. And the doctor told us if she'd left it another 20 minutes without proper care, they'd have been looking at a skin graft instead of stitches. 2nd degree, most of it. 3rd degree, in one spot the size of a $50, right at the base of her thumb, the hand she uses to hold a pen, to can tomatoes, to write, "I'm proud of you," in a card to some kid who needed to hear it. The nurse who took care of us, a young man named Miguel, who couldn't have been more than 25, kept glancing at me while he worked. This careful, searching kind of look, like he was trying to figure out whether he needed to ask me something he didn't quite know how to ask. Finally, he just said, quiet, not looking up from what he was doing. Was anybody with her when it happened? And I told him the truth. Family was in the house. Nobody came until I got there. He didn't say anything else about it. But I saw him write something down, and I saw the look he gave the resident who came in after him, and I understood that this wasn't the first time he'd seen that particular kind of injury paired with that particular kind of silence in a room, and it wouldn't be the last. Here's the part of this story I need you to sit with, because it's the part that told me everything about who actually shows up. While Carol was getting stitched up, my phone rang. It was Diane Okafor, who lives 2 doors down from us on Larkspur, and who Carol's known for going on 15 years, ever since Diane and her husband moved in with their twin boys still in strollers. Diane wasn't calling about anything to do with us. She was calling to ask if Carol still had her good roasting pan, the one she'd borrowed back in October. But when I told her where we were and why, Diane didn't even finish the sentence, "Oh my God," before she was already telling me she was getting her keys. She was at that hospital in under 20 minutes. She'd stopped at the pharmacy on the way and brought burn cream, the good kind, the kind they don't always stock in the ER gift shop, because her own mother had been a nurse for 30 years and Diane still remembered things like that. She sat with us for close to 2 hours. She held Carol's good hand while they finished the stitches. She kept saying, "I've got you, Carol. You just breathe. I've got you." And every time Carol tried to apologize, tried to say she was sorry for pulling Diane away from her evening, Diane just shook her head and said it again. "I've got you." Like it wasn't a kindness. Like it was just a fact. Melissa didn't call until almost 10 that night. We were already home, Carol propped up on the couch with her bandaged hand resting on a pillow, and I picked up the phone so Carol wouldn't have to shift. "Hey, is Mom okay? Dale said you guys went to the ER?" she said. And there was something in her voice that wasn't quite worry. It was closer to mild surprise, the tone you'd use if you heard someone had gotten a flat tire. I told her 6 stitches. I told her 2nd-degree burns, 3rd degree in one spot. There was a pause on the line, maybe 3 seconds, long enough that I could hear the television going in the background at her place, and then she said, "Okay, well, she's home now though, right? She's okay?" Gary and his wife had left around 7, Melissa mentioned, almost as an aside, like it was relevant information I needed. Something about not wanting the evening to turn into a whole ordeal for everyone. A whole ordeal. That phrase sat in my chest the rest of that night like a stone I'd swallowed. Not that she hadn't come running the second it happened. I could have understood a delay if there'd been confusion, if nobody had realized how bad it was. But she'd looked at it. She'd stood there and looked at her mother's hand, blistering up in real time, and told her to run it under water, and gone back outside. Somewhere in Melissa's head, in that moment, her own mother's burned hand had gotten filed away next to something like a spilled drink at a barbecue, an inconvenience to be managed quickly, so the real evening could continue. I didn't say much back to her. I told her we'd talk soon, and I hung up, and I sat in the doorway of our bedroom a long while, watching Carol sleep. Finally, after the pain medication took hold, I thought about every excuse I'd made for that girl over the years, without ever quite calling it an excuse. Melissa's got a lot on her plate with the new house. Melissa's always been squeamish about blood, ever since she was little. Melissa didn't mean anything by it. I'd been doing her explaining for her so long, I think I'd forgotten somewhere along the way that a grown woman is supposed to do her own explaining. I want to tell you I confronted her the next morning. That's not what happened, and I promised myself a long time ago I wouldn't dress up these stories to make myself look better than I was. What actually happened is I went quiet. I drove Carol to her follow-up appointment Thursday. I helped her wash her hair over the kitchen sink because she couldn't get the bandage wet, tilting her head back gentle as I could while she laughed a little, embarrassed, saying she felt like a kid getting a shampoo at the salon. I didn't call Melissa. She texted twice that week, both times just, "Hey," checking on Mom, no follow-up, like she was waiting to see if the silence would pass the way it always had before. It didn't pass this time. Something had shifted in me that Tuesday night, and it wasn't loud when it happened. It was more like a light going off in a room I hadn't fully realized I was still standing in. Here's where I need to back up, because there's a piece of this that Melissa didn't know, and still doesn't. Not until she watches this, probably. 5 years ago, Carol's mother, a woman named Eleanor who'd taught piano lessons out of her living room in Danville for almost 40 years, passed away and left behind a modest trust. It wasn't a fortune. There was the little house itself, paid off free and clear, which we'd been renting out to a young couple ever since, and there was an investment account. Eleanor had built slow and steady over 4 decades of piano lesson checks and careful saving. Half of it had gone to Carol outright. The other half, per the original paperwork Eleanor drew up years before she died, was earmarked to transfer to Melissa, her only grandchild, once she turned 35. Melissa knew there was something coming. Families talk about these things in vague terms sometimes, comfortable and unspecific, and I think that vague, comfortable knowledge had let her get a little too relaxed about what she owed the people it was coming from. I hadn't touched that paperwork in 5 years. That Thursday morning, I called Eleanor's old estate attorney, a woman named Patricia Alvarez, who'd handled the trust since the beginning, and I sat in her office on Redmond Street and told her what I wanted to change. I didn't do it out of spite. I need you to understand that, because I know how it can sound. I did it because I finally let myself ask a question I should have asked years before that Tuesday. If something happened to me, who would actually be there for Carol the way Diane had been there in that waiting room? Who had already answered that question, without being asked, without being paid, without even being family by blood? Patricia drew up the amendment over the following 2 weeks. Carol's portion stayed exactly as it was, hers to do with, as she chose. But the portion earmarked for Melissa, the language in Eleanor's original document, got restructured. Instead of coming to Melissa outright at 35, it now funds a reading program through the elementary school, where Carol taught for almost 3 decades, named for Eleanor, for kids who need extra help getting started with books, the way Carol spent her whole career helping kids get started. And the rental house itself, the little place in Danville, passes to Diane Okafor in recognition, the document says, of extraordinary and sustained care shown to Carol Tuck. Diane doesn't know yet. Nobody knows yet except Patricia, Carol, and me. And now all of you. Carol cried when I told her, and it wasn't the same kind of crying I'd seen on that kitchen floor. She asked me twice if I was certain, if I wasn't doing this in anger, and I told her the truth. I wasn't angry when I signed it. I was just done building a future around the idea that Melissa would eventually grow into the daughter we kept telling ourselves she already was. The conversation with Melissa, when it finally happened, wasn't dramatic, which I think caught her more off guard than shouting would have. It was a Saturday, 3 weeks after the burn, and she came by on her own, no call ahead, the same way I'd come home that Tuesday. Carol was over at Diane's, actually, the two of them on Diane's back porch drinking iced tea, which has become something of a habit between them since. Melissa found me in the garage, where I was cleaning out the gutters into a bucket, and she asked, straight out, why I'd been so distant, her word, and why Dale had mentioned that Aunt Patricia, which is what our families always called her, even though there's no blood relation, had been out to see us twice in 1 month. So I told her all of it. The burn, the stitches, the reading program, the house going to Diane. She got very still, the way I imagine I must have looked standing over Carol on that kitchen floor, and she said, "So you're punishing me, over one bad afternoon?" "No," I said, and I kept my voice level, because it didn't need to be anything else. "I'm done pretending that afternoon was the first time. It was just the first time I finally let myself see it clearly." She asked if there was anything she could do to change my mind. I told her the honest answer, that I wasn't holding this over her as leverage, that I wasn't looking for an apology tour or some grand gesture on my birthday, and that the money had never really been the point in the first place. The point was 10 or 15 minutes on a kitchen floor, and how easy it had been for her to walk back outside. She left angry that day. She's still a little angry now, if I'm being honest with you, the way I try to be honest in these stories. Dale's tried smoothing things over twice since then, and I appreciate the effort, even if it hasn't landed the way he hoped. But Melissa hasn't called her mother once to ask how the hand is healing, whether the scar at the base of her thumb has faded any, whether she can still grip a pen the way she used to. She can, mostly. There's a small patch of tightness there on cold mornings, Carol says, like a reminder tucked into her own skin. You'd only notice it if you knew exactly where to look. I'm not going to sit here and tell you this story ends with Melissa showing up at our door with flowers and everybody hugging it out in the driveway with the neighbors watching. It doesn't end that way. Some of you watching this have lived a version of that ending, the reconciliation, the grown child who finally comes around, and I'm genuinely glad for you if that's your story. This isn't that story, and I'm not going to pretend it is just to give you a tidier finish. This is the story of a man who spent 3 decades assuming his daughter would grow into the person he kept describing her as, on her own timeline, in her own time, and who finally stopped waiting around for that timeline to show up on its own. What I've got instead of a reconciliation is quieter than that, and it took me some months to understand it was enough. It might be more than enough. Carol's hand healed clean, for the most part. The doctors said she was lucky, all things considered, that another 20 minutes could have meant a much longer recovery, skin grafts, the whole difficult process that comes with that. The scar at the base of her thumb faded down to almost nothing, a thin, pale line you'd have to be looking for. Diane still comes by most weeks, though these days it's less about borrowing roasting pans and more about the two of them sitting on one porch or the other with sweet tea, laughing about something one of Carol's old students said to her at the grocery store, or arguing gently about whose tomatoes came in better this year. Some Saturdays, it's the two of them together at the farmer's market downtown. Some evenings, it's the three of us, me and Carol and Diane's husband Marcus, out on our own back patio, not talking about Melissa at all, just talking about ordinary things. Whether the Cardinals have a shot this season, whether I finally need to replace the fence along the side yard before winter gets here, Carol reading us little snippets from cards that arrived that week, from students of hers, some of them grown now with kids of their own. I used to believe that peace, real peace, meant everybody circling back together eventually, the whole family whole again around one table. I don't believe that anymore, not the way I used to. I think peace is something quieter than that. I think peace is finally understanding you don't need everyone to circle back in order to have it. If any part of this story landed with you tonight, I'd ask you to think for a minute about the people in your own life who show up the first time you need them, without being asked twice, without being reminded, without it needing to be convenient for their evening. And think, too, about the ones who need to be asked, and asked again, even when it's their own mother bleeding, or burned, or sitting alone on a kitchen floor waiting for somebody to notice. Take care of the ones who show up. That's really all I've got for you tonight. I'll see you next time.